good. Okay, are you going to cough through this whole thing? And for generations, they're going to have this broadcast. They're going to hear this. Okay. All right. Well, okay, so my plan is I'll kind of drone on a little bit and, you know, kind of the rest of the story till, say, maybe 11:30, and then let's start to review, and I'll say, do you remember this? And then you say, no, right. And do you remember this? No, right. Okay, does that sound like we got a plan?
I have one quick question before we go.
Okay.
Are we your only block of this class?
Yes. Yeah, so you guys are my personal favorites, actually. Okay. So anyway, this is us, and I can't tell you how fun it is. You know, in Provo, every class I teach, I have a microphone, and then they're in a big auditorium. So smallest class, maybe 250. And you know, I have some of my students will come up and they'll go, you know, I really like your class, and I'll say, well, when did you take it? And they'll go, I'm in your class now. You're like, you know, I never have seen you out, you know, in the whole thing. And so this is actually much more fun. And I can actually see your faces when I go, no, you don't get it. You know, a difficulty, and some of you may say I relate to this, is for some of you it's your second language or maybe your third language. And I use a term that was prominent in the 19th century. And you're going, what are you talking about? So, you know, so that's a, you know, I feel sorry that I'm still, come on, you can say it better. Well, okay. So one thing before we start, something pretty funny happened in our Relay Society. And, you know, on Sunday, you know how you, okay. Anyway, it was funny enough that I'm going to share it. There was one lady that got up, and it was testimony time. And she goes, knock, knock. And then there's silence. And somebody go, well, who's there? And she goes, aren't you glad you're here at Relay Society? And she sat down. So obviously you realize she's got my attention. I had never quite heard a testimony like that. And then really fun. So finally, you know, she does add something else. And her conclusion was that, you know, when Adam and Eve gave Adam the apple, she couldn't understand why he would fall for an apple. But if she had handed him a mango, then it would all made sense. Anyway, so it was one of those Relay Societies that, you know how they kind of melt together, and suddenly you go, you know, this is going to be one I'm going to remember for quite some time. But so I'd like to invite you to the LIE 6th Ward, and you know, come to Relay Society. I hope she's there this next week. I can hardly wait. Well, okay. So okay, we're doing the rest of the story. So we've now learned the rest of the story on Boggs, and you know, this great hero, the Mexican War. Eventually, Donovan. You know, we know how he got paid off, and probably should have waited on that. A couple of other things I think you'd find pretty interesting. You curious about what happens to Sidney Rigdon? Okay, for Sidney Rigdon, remember he's the one that was in Liberty Jail. He defends himself, and now he leaves town. And as he leaves town, he's got a horse, he's got a new suit of clothes, and he eventually finds the Saints in Quincy, Illinois. When he finds the Saints in Quincy, they have no idea about the trial. All they know is Sidney has escaped. Well, when Joseph finally escapes, he comes to Quincy, and there's Sidney. And he's now seeing him for, you know, the first time since the jail. And Joseph announces we're going to have a general conference. And it's going to be a general conference in which they sustain the brethren. Well, okay, Sidney was serving as a first counselor in the first presidency. So in Quincy, Joseph wants to know, do you sustain him as a prophet, seer, and revelator? And then he wants to know, do you sustain Quincy? Or do you sustain Sidney Rigdon? At which point, Joseph then says, I want to tell you about Sidney Rigdon. And he said, I no longer want him as my counselor. But Joseph never mentions the court scene. And Joseph says, I can't trust the man anymore. At which point, people there in Quincy start talking about wonderful Sidney Rigdon. You know, we've loved his speeches, he's baptized us, and the result is the congregation of the church voted against Joseph. And they voted, Joseph, you will keep Sidney Rigdon as your counselor. Joseph then stands up and he says, you give me Sidney, I throw him back at you. In other words, he goes, I don't want him, I'll throw him back, but okay. So you'd say all the days of Joseph's life, from this, 1840 through his life to 1844, Sidney Rigdon is a counselor, but a counselor in name only. Joseph will hold meetings of the first presidency, but oops, did I forget to invite Sidney? Okay. And finally, Sidney will actually leave Nauvoo, where Joseph has settled, and he will go back to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where in Pittsburgh he had lived. That's where he's originally from. He will be back attending the Baptist church and actually preaching at the Baptist church, but on our books and our sustaining, he's still in the first presidency of the church. And you'd be like, in Illinois, Sidney is a counselor, but Sidney's living in Pittsburgh, and he's a very active member of the Baptist church. Well, okay, how do you get this? You give me Sidney, I throw him back at you. Well, we're going to learn that Joseph Smith will die on June 27, 1844, there in Carthage. Where is Sidney then when Joseph dies? Where do you think? He's out in Pittsburgh. And for Sidney Rigdon, he claims on June 27, 1844, about 5:15, the very time that Joseph is dying, Sidney claims he saw an angel. Now, he will hold to that all the days of his life. And, I'm pretty convinced he saw something. He just forgot to say, could we shake on that? Let me shake hands, as you read the Doctrine and Covenants, you want to make sure. And so for Sidney, he eventually will work his way to Nauvoo because he claims that the angel told him to take the church to Pittsburgh. What is the chances, But to take the church to Pittsburgh, and there Christ will come to rule and reign. Well, Sidney Rigdon has such a kind of persuasive personality that he literally takes 1,000 people out of Nauvoo and he takes them to Pittsburgh, and then in Pittsburgh he forms a church called the Church of Jesus Christ, or Rigdonites. Everybody gets an ites, and so he has his own church back there. And the kind of crazy thing about his church, at one point Sidney decides that he will figure out the exact day that Christ is coming on his second coming. So he looks through the New Testament, Old Testament. No man knows the day or the hour, but Sidney got it. He now tells his congregation, come to our chapel here in Pittsburgh and practice jumping, and the Lord will then pick you up in amazing rapture. So people come in white, they come to his church, and they're going, catch me, Lord, and jump, 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 jump. And, Christ doesn't come. Well, okay. In the meantime, the people had given away their things, and they come back home, and, wow, I had it, but I gave it to my son, and, Sidney doesn't just do this once, but he does it 3 times. And you can imagine those 1,000 people he took out of Nauvoo will eventually, most of them, go away from Sidney. So what happens to Sidney? He dies outside of the church, founding his own church. Okay, what happens to a man named George Hinkle? What did Joseph call George Hinkle? Judas Iscariot. Remember, George Hinkle's the man that does what? Betrays Joseph. General Lucas, here are your prisoners. What happens to George Hinkle? Well, George Hinkle, like Sidney Rigdon, forms his own church. And you'd say, George's church lasts less than a year. Tell me, can it be true? No? Okay, so he has the most unusual name for his church. I actually can't figure out what he's saying, but his church is called the Church of Jesus Christ, and I get that part. But then he calls, the subtitle, is bride of the Lamb's wife. And you're like, huh. Well, okay, for him, he will spend his days being a farmer, and he's gone. Curious, what happens to General Clark? General Clark becomes remember his men in Richmond. He becomes a governor of the state of Missouri. What about Samuel Lucas, where he says, worst thing I ever did for my political career was to allow Joseph to preach on the streets of Missouri. For Samuel Lucas, he will spend out his days as the little clerk in the court of Jackson County. So you know how you see the courtroom setting and you see somebody writing all the notes? That would be, in his case, Samuel Lucas. Well, okay, bigger items. I got to get Joseph out of jail, and I want to say what happens to Brigham and his people. Well, for Brigham and his people, remember they're on this trail called the Trail of what? Tears. And they're going 200 miles trying to work their way to Quincy, Illinois. The reason they're heading to Quincy is a barge town, meaning a boat town. And if you get across the banks in Missouri, the river's not so wide, and the people can see you there, and then they would take their barges, and then you get on their barge, and they would transport you across the Mississippi River to Quincy. Well, the problem was, as the saints came out towards Quincy, suddenly ice is flowing in the Mississippi River. And ice, if you've ever seen ice flow, you can see the top, but you always know down below there's a whole bunch of ice. And so all of a sudden, all those barges, boats, stopped going back and forth. Now, as they stopped going, suddenly you've got 5,000 plus Latter-day Saints who are on one side of the river, can see the town of Quincy, and you've got people in the town, they had what they called spy glasses back then, who can look across the river, and suddenly they see the people, and it's obvious that we are starving, and we don't have blankets. We're working, we're hoping for the goodness of the people at Quincy. Well, all of a sudden they go, we're seeing people that are going to die if we don't do something. The people of Quincy, and the people of Quincy were Democrats. And the Democrats had a very strong organization in the community of 1,600 people. So the Democratic Party that we know in the United States met, and their conclusion was, let us go into our general stores, and even if we risk our own lives, let us get out of the stores then food, clothing, blankets, that we can at least get across to these people until the whole river ices up, and they can then run across. Now, these people, their goodness in risking their lives, and not all of them will make it, as they came over and then tried to get back with the flowing ice in the river. Joseph Smith said about these people in that political party, he said, if it had not been, he said, the people of Quincy were like good Samaritans to the saints. And he said, if it had not been for them, he said, I could have gone toe-to-toe with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob if it had not been for the kindness of the people at Quincy. Okay, so the people of Quincy have now provided some kind of assistance. Soon the river will ice over, and the people in Quincy began yelling to the Mormons on the other side, run, but send your children first. And the reason is because the ice, if you're big, you're going to crack the ice, okay? If you're a kid, you send the kids, and you send them one at a time, and we will care for them. So you have the Latter-day Saints, the women, are now saying to their little kids, run. In other words, we don't even know you people over there, but we know that you were kind enough to have provided the blankets and things we needed. So you get the little kids, and you hear these, run, Mosiah, run, run, run. Okay, the kids go across. Okay, let's send teenagers. Okay, the ice is held. And you get, okay, so you weigh less than 100 pounds, go. And then finally, you get the adults now coming across. Among those who cross on the ice will be Emma. And as she goes, she doesn't want to send her children without her. And so as she crosses, by this point, she has 2 babies in arms. She has, who's her oldest? Julia. She's holding on her skirt. Joseph Smith III holding on the other side. For Emma, she's sewn into her skirt a large pocket, and she's carrying Joseph's translation of the Bible. She has been able to spare that, as William McClellan, remember, has broken into her home and taken everything, and she now, with her children, will quickly try and make it across. Well, okay, once they are in Quincy, when Brigham Young sees the kindness and learns that it was the Democratic Party, the Democrats now ask Brigham, well, which party are you people? And Brigham says, because of your kindness, we are all what? Democrats. So if you were to say, what was Brigham Young? Democrat. What was Joseph Smith? Democrat. What was Heber C. Kimball? Democrat. And the incredible thing, you get all kinds of people, even going up through the generations to our time, that will say, what was the way they viewed? Joseph said, we must never forget the kindness, goodness of Quincy. And many people, including some in my family, will say, every year when we vote, we don't care who's running for office. We vote Democratic because we want to remember Quincy. Okay, and for some of you, just went ah. But it was, you can trace that back as where were we at one point, in our political leanings. Well, okay, once they are in Quincy, you get they're at the park, they're taken into these good people's homes, and try and imagine 1,600 people in Quincy are taking well over 5,000 people in their homes to care for them. And, that's just huge. You think, well, okay, so you're going to be gone for a week. Yeah, I'd watch your dog. But all of a sudden you're like, how many people? Well, okay. In that park, Brigham Young started doing a roll call count. And the roll call went like this. He would then say, who's here? Tell me your name. We need your name. And do you have every family member? The man would say, yep, we made it to safety. Okay, who are you? Great, do you have every family member? No, I'm missing my daughter-in-law. Can we organize to go back and get her? In other words, the trail of tears was a two-way. One, you get to safety. We then take our strongest men, you go back on that trail, and you bring out people who hadn't been able to come out. And invariably, you get someone saying, no, when the militia came upon my daughter-in-law, and whatever they were going to do, she said she denied that Joseph was a prophet, and the Book of Mormon was what? Word of God. So you have the roll call count is who's with us, who are we missing, rescue group, let's go back and get him, who's with us, who are we missing, well, we're not going to go back and get him. Okay, got it? Okay, those roll call counts will continue the winter then of 1839. Okay, by March 15th of 1839, Brigham Young concludes, I've got everybody out of the state who says that Joseph's a prophet, the Book of Mormon is the Word of God, except for those still in jails. Okay, where's Parley P. Pratt? He's still in Richmond. Okay, where's Joseph and Hiram? They're in Liberty. Now, okay, so all of a sudden you get, different things. You start getting men sent to, can you come up with a strategy, a plan to be able to help break them out? And I'm only going to do where Joseph is. Okay, for Joseph, time now passes. And in the meantime, Alexander Donovan is now writing to Lilburn W. Boggs saying, help us. And he's writing to say, help us get Joseph a different place to be in jail. Because they're trying to feed him, quote, Mormon beef. Okay, remember the black man, they chopped up his leg, tried to feed him. Okay, let's get him a different place. Let's get him outside of Liberty. Let's put him to a different jail while he awaits, the time for the next court. So finally, I'm hard put to say anything good about Lilburn W. Boggs, but he does agree that Joseph and the fellow prisoners, you can be transferred to a different facility. Now, as Joseph and fellow prisoners are being transferred to a different facility, suddenly the sheriff, kind of like the jailer, who had been taking care of Joseph those 5 months, he actually likes Joseph. He doesn't think that they're guilty, even though the court of law has pronounced, yes, guilty, and Donovan says appeal. So one night, as they're being transferred, you got a sheriff, you got a lot of men helping him. Suddenly, the sheriff now comes to Joseph, and he says, tonight we're going to get drunk, and we're going to get stone drunk. And the sheriff says, when we get up in the morning, I don't expect to see you or any of the prisoners. And he said, and I also don't expect to see my horses. What's the sheriff saying? Go, run, escape. Well, okay. That night, here's Joseph, fellow prisoners. They're all watching, and the sheriff and his men just, get plastered out of their minds. They're drunk. And suddenly, you get the prisoners are grabbing the horses, and they are going fast. For Joseph, they kind of split up, let's go different directions, and but they're all eventually going to end up in Quincy. And Joseph describes between he and Hiram, they have one horse. So while one person rides, the other one runs along. And then, whoo, I can't run another step. Great, I'm running. And the other one's on top of the horse. Now this, okay. Finally, they have made it mostly across the state. They're getting very close to cross the river. And, okay, we turn our attention to Lucy Mack Smith and Joseph Smith Sr., who have made it to Quincy. That night, Lucy describes that she has a dream. And in her dream, she sees her two sons, Joseph and Hiram, and they are way too skinny. Does this sound like a mom? Okay. And they need food. And so she sees them and that they are hurrying to where she's at. She then wakes up her husband. And she says, Joseph and Hiram will be here in the morning. And she says, I need you to get up and get the fire ready, so that she can cook things. She says, I've got to make a lot of food because they're starving and they're real too skinny. Well, for Joseph Smith Sr., he goes, it's just the musings of an old woman. Now, I said to my husband, call me anything but not old woman, Okay, he goes, no, it's like your imagination of an old woman. Well, Lucy says, you just wait and see. She gets up. She fixes food, and the next morning, there were young boys who were in the habit of going down to the river to fish in the morning. As they're down at the river, who should they see? But here comes now Joseph and Hiram coming across in a boat because the time of ice is gone. As they get to the other side, the young boys all excited. They go running through the town. Eventually, Lucy hears. She then turns to her husband, says, see, I told you so. She then runs to where Emma is staying, and suddenly Joseph is now back. Well, okay, Joseph does one thing when he's back that I thought you'd find pretty interesting. Joseph is very angry with the state of Missouri. Now, at that time, and it wouldn't work today, but you've probably all seen old kind of movies where you get, Missouri, you couldn't cross over to Illinois because you have no jurisdiction. So Joseph in the state of Missouri, he still has, at his death, 27 charges against him, including now he's escaped. So there's another 28, and who knows what else, taking a horse. But, he has all these charges against him. So, but you'd say across the river in Illinois, he is a free man. And he can even run for president of these United States. He just can't cross over to Missouri. Okay, so you got it. So they were like, they're all separate. Well, okay. Before I say what happened to Joseph, you're curious what happens to the sheriff?
Yes.
Okay, well, okay, the sheriff that kind of goes, I don't care, court of law and all that. I think you're free, go. And I don't think you did anything. Well, okay, so sheriff and his men, they conclude, we're going to come up with a story that we all agree upon, and when we come back to town, we're going to say what happened. Well, they come back to town and they say, oh, wow. You know, I'm sorry I didn't take enough men because the prisoners rose up and they attacked us and they succeeded and they took our horses. Tell me, do the people in town believe it?